And I've said before that this was not immediately a popular fight. Even among the gay community. So I gave one example of that. The civil rights organisation that is meant to represent LGBT people. When 3 couples began to sue the state of Hawaii in 1991, Lambda refused to assist or represent them. So that's how much the gay community itself has changed since pre-1989 to 2015. It's been a radical transformation. And even, so in 1991, it was white male heterosexual who took up their case and fought for them. I say that to illustrate how much has changed in the last 32 years. Even when we come to 2010, gay marriage is an issue in the United Kingdom. In the UK, in 1989, a charity was set up called the Stonewall Charity. And by today, they are the largest LGBT lobbying group in Europe. So in 2010, people are fighting for gay marriage in the UK. And the head of the Stonewall Charity goes public. And he says, we have not given a position on gay marriage and we won't now. History is complicated. There's never just one neat storyline. And good guys and bad guys. The Stonewall Charity ended up changing their tune because of the amount of angry responses to that statement. But this is how much has changed since 1989. We traced it through 89, 91, 96, 21, 2001. Two 2004, 2009, 2012. And as we would expect, comes to a crisis point And 2014 is the midpoint. A turning point year in its own right. But also a midpoint between two major Supreme Court decisions. That dismantled what had been put into place in 1996. A lesbian couple and a gay couple. From 2015 forward, the fight has been largely won on the side of gay marriage. I'll just share the photo with you that I'd wanted to share before, but I couldn't. My fault, but this is the wedding of Jim Obergefell and John Arthur. Shortly before John Arthur passed away. And their state's failure to recognise their marriage was a catalyst in his involvement in that 2015 Supreme Court decision. So that is the history of homosexual and lesbian rights from 1989 to 2015. And without going into details, I hope we can understand why the conservative right has become so vitriolic since then. This is not the only thing that has bruised them, but it is a major one. I want us to go back into ancient history. We understand now our immediate history. But we need to put it into context. How significant is it? We won't really see the significance unless we go back and see what has existed before. Now, this is the part where I get nervous. Just going to put in a little more detail onto the top line. And then we'll erase the bottom. Babylon, Protestant Reformation, 1888. We're not going to go into this history, but I'll leave it there as reference. When we wanted to understand Adventism, where did we look? Protestantism. You have to understand the context. What is being imbibed? So most of the time period from May 2020 to now as I've said a couple of times now, we're going back and looking at the history of Protestantism. I don't want to go to Protestantism. I want to go to Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, Greece, and Rome. I'll erase them for now. Now this is where I get nervous. Because I know that other people have looked into history. Whether it's ancient pagan nations or indigenous populations. And individuals have come to, I'm sure, have come to their own thoughts and conclusions. And my concern is that I could very easily, in this series, just end up disagreeing with absolutely everyone. I'm hoping that what I present makes logical sense. I do fear that media literacy is still an issue this movement can struggle with. And when you go back and look at history, it's not just the religious right that can manipulate history to suit themselves. The left can do that as well. So I'm going to go particularly through 3 pagan nations. Egypt, Greece, and Rome. We're not going to go through them in that order. Going to start with Greece. So I have by far the most to say about Greece. And perhaps the reasons why for that might make sense to you already. They're known for same-sex relationships. So as I said before, I hope not, but I fear that I may end up disagreeing with everyone. Because when we look at history, first of all, we need to find, I would suggest, the best sources. But also, we can't just believe what suits us. If we don't like it, we don't like it. But facts remain. So there's a number of difficulties in going into this history, and I want to list them all to begin with. Things that are going to instruct us as we look through history. The first one is that what we'll be covering is a new subject. Because we're going to be discussing sex. And many people in the movement are still uncomfortable with us discussing sex. Which I don't really understand why. Every Adventist believes that God has things to say on every facet of your life. The one decision that can have the most wide range of consequences, you think he has nothing to say. Or if he does, you'd prefer it written so you can go and read it somewhere private. So everyone's heard Elder Parminder's series on relationships. And you know that he has discussed this topic. Many aspects of it. So now it's my turn. So that's a disclaimer to begin with. We'll be discussing relationships, but particularly sex. And as you might imagine, historical societies never wanted to talk about sex. So historical societies would meet and talk about ancient Greece, but they would just pretend this was not part of it. And that attitude did not change until the late 1970s. So I'm not saying it's a new subject for us, this is a new subject externally. Only being really discussed in historical societies since about 1978. When a book was published called Greek Homosexuality, and it opened up that discussion in mainstream societies. So by the time you get to the 1980s, they're finally starting to address this topic. But as you might imagine, everyone comes to that topic hoping to see what they want to see. Making arguments that fit their present day desires for what they want to see in present day society. So that's the difficulty with it being a new subject and a sensitive subject. And one of the reasons I've not shared many articles on the broadcast about this subject is that it is almost entirely impossible, almost impossible, to find a source that isn't touched by bias. The issue is foreign language. When we try and understand an ancient civilization like Greece, we're dealing with an ancient language. And then it all gets into Latin. So when you go back to their language, they had no word that meant that was a replacement for our modern word homosexual. They had no equivalent. So when you go to a liberal article and they're going to quote Plato, and he's going to say that homosexual relationships are positive, you know that's not what he's saying in a modern day context. So first of all, he is not using the modern term for homosexual. And second, he could not be using their equivalent because they had none. So there's the issue with translation. The third issue is one I've already touched on, bias. When they do that, they don't quote Plato towards the end of his life. When towards the end, he said that the same-sex relationships that they did have were essentially an abomination. Because he changed his positions over the course of his life. So bias becomes an issue. I will quote from one online source. About the sacred band of Thebes. It says 3,000 years ago in ancient Greece, being gay or lesbian was not a crime. In fact, in certain situations, the Greeks even encouraged homosexual relationships. That's just wrong. We can't go into a confusing area of history and make it what we want it. Because that tiny phrase, in certain situations, frankly, that tiny qualifier is not big enough to fix how much they've twisted the history. And most liberal sources will take their bias to Greek history as well as conservative ones. The fourth issue is male perspective. It's all written from a male perspective. So if you want to know what a woman's experience was, or what a woman thought in ancient Greece and Rome, generally you're not going to find anything. And when they see men describe or illustrate a woman's sexual experience, much like male directors of movies today, they don't end up illustrating a true female experience. And they can see this even in those societies when they're illustrating women having sex. They're discussed, carved, illustrated by men. Largely for men. One thing that people have trouble with is that a woman can have pleasure without being penetrated. And they didn't like that fact either. So their sexism shows even in their art. The other issue is contradictions. Any society has a variety of experiences and perspectives. Less back then than now, I would suggest. Less back then than now. Because I would suggest even more so back then, you belonged to the state. But still, if you look out today, some of the people who will be left the most famous do not represent the lives of normal society. So there's the danger of pulling out one case and thinking that somehow is a representative of general society. We're covering a time period of hundreds, even thousands of years. When you go from Mesopotamia, Assyria to the end of pagan Rome. And all of them have famous legends or famous people that may look outside of the ordinary. What we want to see is the positions of their government and general society. In the early 1900s, in the first decade of the 1900s, 2 women in Spain got married and then fled. They are not representative of general society. (1905) Spain. The conservative faction of the Catholic Church reveres 2 women to a much higher extent than the liberal. Lucia and Mary. But what is the experience of normal conservative Catholic women compared to a liberal Catholic woman? Does the conservatives' worship of female goddesses and prophetesses make them view ordinary women better? Just like papal Rome, same with pagan Rome. Doesn't matter if a society has goddesses. That doesn't mean that women in their societies are treated particularly well. So we have to watch out for seeming contradictions and look to general society as much as we can. The last difficulty is the limitations of presenting. Now, with this format, we can't read a lot. And it's similar to how difficult it was to teach parts of Protestantism. And I ended up just stating things as fact. Because the perspective had either been gleaned from many different sources, or from the audio of a 30-hour book. And this is a more difficult subject than the history of Protestantism. And once I started to come to what is my position on this subject, found there was almost no sources that I could agree with even 80%. In fact, in my notes, there's one source where I have one sentence because I couldn't stand anything but one sentence. But they worded the one sentence nicely, so I saved it. So I know this is a subject where people have many different positions. And then when a secular author discusses this and then brings in the Bible, then they make a terrible mess. So I'll do my best. Ancient Greece. I want to begin by quoting Aristotle. I've got 3 quotes. He says, the female is, as it were, a deformed male. Male, formed. Female, deformed. He says the relation of male to female is by nature a relation of superior to inferior. To ruler to ruled. The male, unless constituted in some respect contrary to nature, is by nature more expert at leading than the female. And the elder and complete than the younger and incomplete. Elder, complete. Young, incomplete. So Aristotle is known for his sexism, but he's by no means alone. Some of their writers and philosophers and poets had even worse views. And some, like Plato, had better views. But even Plato, if you see him comprehensively, was still quite sexist. So they see the male as vastly superior to the female. They talk about reason over emotion. The intellect. But especially the body. This is where we need to take ourselves from modern day society and plant ourselves in Greek society. And put our modern day brain to one side for the moment. This is a time of hot war and Olympic Games. Muscle, power, skill. Is embodied in the masculine. And we could think of women as being revered for being able to birth children. But remember that For them, they did not think, many of them did not think that a woman contributed anything to the offspring. This is where the idea of a seed comes from. You plant your seed, and everything's in that seed to become an oak. And they see sperm as the seed. In fact, when one man killed his mother, one of their poets argued that he couldn't be convicted of killing a blood relative because his mother never contributed to him. So a mother could not be a blood relative. She was the soil that grew the seed. There was at times a popular view that a woman's period was sperm. But because she was deformed, she couldn't keep sperm alive and it would exit up her body with blood. So, not very good views of women. Their worship of the physical form was concentrated heavily on the masculine. The Greek ideal of beauty was embodied most perfectly in the male youth. We have to understand that in that way, our mindset in the 21st century is a bit different. If you were to ask a lot of people today, what is just the human embodiment of perfect beauty? The accepted secular answer is Beyonce. She's the queen. She embodies perfect beauty. But back then, true perfect beauty was masculine, not feminine. Because of the construct of their whole society and mindset. It was similar for the Romans. The embodiment of perfection was the male youth. And they revered that beauty. Youth being for them about 13 to late 20s, puberty to late 20s, 30. How their society operated generally was with the practice of pederasty. I'm quoting from the document. The ideal pederastic relationship in ancient Greece involved an Erastes, an older male, usually in his mid to late 20s, and an eromenos, a young male who has passed puberty, usually no older than 18. So we're discussing how society generally operated for the Greeks. What would happen is the following. They would develop relationships between an older male and a young male. Before subscribing morality to anything, we should put ourselves back in their mindset. The Erastes is the teacher. The eromenos is the student. So while there was a form of sex involved, and we'll get to that, there was the physical. This is a teacher-student relationship. The teacher is expected to take on a young Greek male and teach him how to be a good Greek warrior, a good Greek politician, a good Greek citizen. The teacher is mid-late 20s, about that age. And the student just had to have passed puberty. There is a grey area where both ages could be, it wasn't always strictly this. So depending on the source, I'll say 13 to 18, 21. Pretty much as soon as they could see his body, his height and any beard develop. And he would need to be seen no longer as a student. Now he was an adult male. They trace the this social construct back to Crete. There's not universal agreement of where it came from, but they believe about 700 BC. Really coming out of a Greek male-dominated culture, homosocial culture. So a male-dominated culture. Delayed marriage for aristocrats. The common practice of having male conferences where they'd all meet and discuss. Pretty much just the prevalence of the social seclusion of women. Both art and literary references show that the Eremos was at least a teen. Ages ranging from about 13 to 20. In unusual cases, it could be lasting up until 30. That was unusual. The most settled age range is about 15 to 17. The Erastus teacher would see a young boy that he liked, and he would start to pursue this young man. Offering him gifts, praise. It was some type of, he would need to convince the young man, child really. It was meant to be a mentorship program. But there was also a sexual component and a relationship, even lasting for, it could stay just in a mentorship, friendship for the rest of their lives. We'll go into detail tomorrow about what would happen as the child grew to an adult. This is where people, I believe this is one of the reasons that people start tying what they would say is homosexuality to pedophilia. Because they look at this with a modern definition, it's nothing more than pedophilia. The quote starts, the age range, if you can find it. The age range when boys entered into such relationships was consonant equal with that of Greek girls given in marriage, often to adult husbands many years their senior. Boys, however, usually had to be courted and were free to choose their mate, their Erastes, while marriages for girls were arranged for economic and political advantage at the discretion of father and suitor. So if you want to tie this to pedophilia, you would equally have to tie their heterosexual marriages to pedophilia. Except in their heterosexual marriages, the girls were generally not even given a choice. So I would suggest the link people draw between what is not homosexuality, we'll get to that, but what they call homosexuality and pedophilia is a lie. It doesn't hold water. Going to continue reading from inquiriesjournal.com. Examining Greek pederastic relationships. The power dynamics involved in such a relationship with the Erastes always in control ensured that the Erastes kept his dignity as a fully functioning member of Greek society, while the Eromenos grew up under the tutelage of such a man and as such could become a great citizen when he reached adulthood. Ideal pederastic couples were ones whose relationship directly benefited their Greek society. So the older would teach the younger about politics, military, and society. The evidence for this being the ideal, pederastic relationship being the most common in Greece is overwhelming. But remember contradictions. There are standout cases of people breaking that model. So you know about the sacred band of Thebes. The liberal will say, look at that beautiful group of 150 gay couples. I would argue this is not today's Jim Obergefell and John Arthur. Because these couples could not be composed of equals. For every couple in the sacred band of Thebes, one would have to be an older teacher and one would have to be a younger student. Now, they were likely closer in age than 13 and 30. Because this student is fighting in a war. But regardless of how that band constructed their army, there had to be a hierarchical difference. We're out of time and I've not gotten to my points. But I just want to say this one thing and then we will revisit it tomorrow in detail. There was a sexual relationship. In the vast majority of cases, there was a physical component. We have more time? Then I'll keep reading. The ancient Greeks did not conceive of sexual orientation as a social identifier, as modern Western societies have done. Greek society did not distinguish sexual desire or behavior by the gender of the participants, but rather by the role that each participant played in the sex act, that of active penetrator or passive penetrated. This active-passive polarization corresponded with dominant and submissive social roles. The active, penetrative role was associated with masculinity, higher social status, and adulthood. While the passive role was associated with femininity, lower social status, and youth. Given the importance in Greek society of cultivating the masculinity of the adult male and the perceived feminizing effect of being the passive partner, relations between adult men of comparable social status were considered highly problematic and usually associated with social stigma. So what they couldn't tolerate was a John Arthur and a Jim Oberger film. Because remember, they worship masculinity. And one of those men would have to be a female. And what are women? Nothing good. This stigma, social stigma, however, was reserved for only the passive partner in the relationship. So if you had two equal males, and they had sex, both of them do not receive the censure or the stigma of society. The person who was the dominant party or penetrated still retains all of his masculinity. Society does not condemn him. They're different they're fine with him. Because sex for them is not attached to the gender of the participants, but they have gendered the act. I hope that makes sense. They would look at a male penetrating or being dominant to another male as fine, just as masculine. The stigma is reserved for anyone approaching the female. According to contemporary opinion, Greek males who engaged in passive anal sex after reaching the age of manhood, at which point they were expected to take the reverse role in pederastic relationships and become the active and dominant member, thereby were feminized or made a woman of themselves. There is ample evidence in the theatre of Aristophanes that derides these passive men and gives a glimpse of the type of biting, social opprobrium and shame heaped upon them by their societies. So liberals today look back at Greek society and try and draw out examples of a society that tolerated same-sex relationships. And conservatives look back and try and link pedophilia to pederasty. And I would argue both are wrong. I would argue that Greek society did not tolerate same-sex relationships among equals. If you're a typical, especially a middle higher class ranked Greek male, pre-puberty, life of a child, puberty, so 13 forward, you become a student of a Greek male. An adult who will train you. You'll be courted by him, you may have a number of suitors and you will end up choosing one. And there's the evidence that the fathers of these boys would hope that they were really pretty and handsome, so they would attract a better teacher. They become an eromonous, a student. This was mostly education, but there was a supposed to be restrained but still existent sexual relationship. Around 18 to 21, you reach adulthood. And this relationship has to end. You cannot stay in a physical relationship with your teacher. Because you're now an adult and he's an adult, now you're equals. And to continue any physical relationship would mean one of them would be seen as feminized. So certainly the education stops, and certainly any physical relationship. roughly 21 to 30, then this then becomes an Orestes and finds another young boy. Has a physical relationship with him and trains him into adulthood. Then that relationship has to end. In about 30, married. A girl of 13 and on, 13, 16. Who is not generally given much of a choice. When we come back tomorrow, I want to expand this simple explanation further and look at the similarities and differences to this that existed in Rome and Egypt. But the point I'm making, if you want to see the significance of what society began to accept in 1989, it's not like society finally looked back at that good Greek civilization and learned something. Because if John Arthur met Jim Obergefell in a bar, that relationship would have been no more tolerated in Greece than conservative American society today. Because this is not a homosexual or gay relationship. We'll come back tomorrow. If you kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Lord, we know how complicated history can become. But as we look back the context, we look back and see what you have observed, and what existed around ancient Israel. We pray that we will have a true perspective. That you might guide us into unity in this movement. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.